Funding for this program has been provided by the Nevada Rangeland Resources Commission.
The saddest part of this whole thing is that the mismanagement of wild horse numbers has not only impacted livestock operators, wildlife populations, and recreational uses of the public land, but it's impacted dramatically the horses themselves.
There are people in the BLM that understand the management of horses and know how to protect the resource. But with the advocates and their ability to pull on the heartstrings of people in cities that have no idea what's going on out here, the system's lost. About all the BLM can hope to do is keep from getting sued.
Well, horses are tougher than any wildlife, and so they'll outlast everything else, and they'll be the last ones.
Over 1/2 century ago, Velma Johnson, a rancher and part-time secretary, became forever known as Wild Horse Annie after experiencing multiple incidents of harassment and cruelty to wild horses. Aided by a flood of letters from school children to Congress, Annie's crusade resulted in passage of the Wild Horse and Burrow Act. Easily passed and signed into law by Richard Nixon in 1971, it declared America's wild horses to be living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West, putting them in a unique category beyond even the Endangered Species Act. Many on both sides of the issue still consider the law well written and a sensible solution to the problem. Unfortunately, the act wasn't enforced as written, and now, 50 years later, the overpopulation of wild horses has created an environmental crisis on our western rangelands. Not all American people's lives have been enriched by the protection of our wild horses. Ranchers, rural communities, wildlife, rangeland forage, and even the horses themselves are now suffering from the wild horse and burrow ruling.
It has created a shift and change in not only the available forage that's out there for all critters, including wildlife and AUMs that were permitted on that allotment before, but the horses themselves. And if you factor that overutilization over a period of several decades, we have one other thing happen as a result of that, and that is not only did we get a reduction in livestock use, we also got a reduction in wildlife numbers because they were actually dependent on that piece of real estate as well. We also saw significant changes in the composition of the forage that's out there on the ground. And by beating that native forage up by the horses over and over again, year in and year out, that vegetation was gradually replaced by noxious weeds.
Nevada ranchers have seen a major impact on their operations. Their livestock compete with horses for forage on the ranchers' designated grazing allotments. Bert and Jill Paris own and operate a cattle ranch in remote central Nevada, south of Battle Mountain.
In our allotment, we're supposed to have 33 head of horses in our portion of the Augusta Mountain HMA. And right now we have at least 300 to 500 head. We've had to adjust accordingly, especially in these dry years. And a lot of that is caused because of the horses. We've given up, I'm going to say, almost a third of our allotment to the horses. And we try to keep our utilization down, of course, on our allotment. So in order to do that, we have to manage the cattle because the horses aren't being managed. So we take the cattle off early, even though we legally could be out there, but our utilization gets down. We start to look at things and we say we need to get them off of there. And the horses get to stay 365 days a year, 7 days a week.
In 2021, the BLM removed over 12,000 horses from western rangelands to off-range corrals. The drought and the increased demand for hay for these gathered horses has also increased both the demand and price of hay. Ironically, Bert Paris now finds himself competing with the BLM for hay for his cattle at an inflated price, because horses have forced him to remove cattle from his allotment and feed them on his private ground.
That's a bit frustrating. You've taken your cattle off the range because you're trying to manage the range correctly, hit your utilization levels. So you're coming off and feeding them hay, and that hay is at an inflated price because there's horses that are eating that same hay that are in horse holding facilities. So that even adds to the frustration we go through, especially economically. There'll be times when we'll be feeding our cows and I can look up on the hill, especially in the springtime, and I can see 200 head of illegal horses grazing there while I'm feeding this hay to my cattle that are in my private property. And that's pretty frustrating to watch every day, to see that, especially when that hay you're feeding these cows is going to these horses. Before 1971, when this act was passed, they inventoried the horses and they allocated numbers for each allotment. I'm supposed to have 33 head of horses in my allotment instead of 500 head of horses. So I'm all for following the Wild Horse and Burrow Act.
Hank Vogler's Eastern Nevada ranch runs both cattle and sheep.
They had an emergency gather here this year in the antelope complex because the horses were starving to death because they'd eat themselves out of house and home. I had to bring the cattle in. Look at these haystacks. Buying hay, brought them in the 1st of March, calved them out on private land, did everything that was extremely expensive. And now the price of hay has gone up because of the drought in the West. It's even going to be worse next year because that country is not going to recover in 1 year. It's going to be long term. So I'm stuck being off of my winter range for 2 years, it looks like, or maybe more.
Even with the recent gather, Vogler's allotment is still far beyond the appropriate management level.
I'm supposed to have 167 head of horses. I had 6,000, now there's 3,800. They've already eaten everything on the public land. There's nothing out there to eat.
Over the past 10 years, the BLM has removed nearly 70,000 horses off the range. Over 36,000 have been adopted through the BLM adoption program, and the remaining 34,000 have been transported to one of 35 off-range corrals or pastures, where they are fed and cared for at a cost of over $70 million a year.
My grandfather came to this country in the late 1890s, 1880, and my dad and uncle asked him how come he ended up here, and his answer was because all the good spots were taken. But I mean, I love it here. This is what we do, and I would really like my grandkids to have a choice as to whether they want to stay here or not.
A sheep rancher all his life, the combination of drought and lack of forage caused by the horses finally forced Gratian Uvalde to sell the last of his sheep.
This spring, with the drought and the wild horse encroachment, I came and looked at this and I thought, there's no use. I waited till the ultimate minute that I could sell my sheep, and we sold them. I didn't want to put my poor sheep through something like this, what we're seeing this summer. Really, they don't deserve it. And I'd been running those sheep since I was 20 years old. I'm 69 now.
Where we would have brought our sheep to this spring on either the Badger Springs or the 30-mile spring allotment basically got overgrazed by wild horses all winter. And with zero moisture to help it grow back this spring, we had no place to take our sheep for the spring and the early summer. That was the deciding factor on selling the herd of sheep that had put this ranch in business so many years ago. I believe he sold 1,800 mother ewes and plus the yearlings.
The appropriate management level for all the horses on the Uvalde allotment is between 300 and 500 head. The current number of over 3,000 grazing all winter have forced the Uvaldes to also abandon plans to graze it with cattle this spring.
You don't get to use all the AUMs that you're allotted, and so we cut back our cows voluntarily. We don't wait for the BLM to tell us that you need to cut your numbers back, because we're out here taking care of these allotments, taking care of the grazing and what's going on them, and we are not going to let our livestock starve to death, so we're not going to turn them out where the feed's already been destroyed.
Jack Neal has managed and then owned a cattle ranch for over 30 years.
My experience with horses and their effect on the public lands and their effect on the wildlife is very gradual. But having been here in this one location for 35 years, it's obvious to me that there has been a degradation.
Jack's HMA is only supposed to have a maximum of 21 head of horses.
I'd say on the low side, we've got 500 on the BLM and probably 300 on the forest. Our forest allotment is supposed to be horse-free. Every year, it seems like our green spots, the riparian areas, get grazed off earlier and earlier. We have been taking photographs before we go on because according to the grazing regulations, we could actually be forced to leave based on the use on those riparians. The horses are there before we are, and they pretty much clean it up before we get there. We use electric fence to keep our cows out of the place that the horses have already decimated. And that just seemed like the backwards way to do it, but that's the way it happens, so that our cows are not blamed for it.
The evidence proves that wild horses are no longer fast disappearing from the American scene. In fact, just the opposite is true.
I could take you to almost every single allotment we've got north of here right now and show you the impacts that overgrazing has had on the understory and the native vegetation, as well as riparian habitats.
As seen here, overgrazed areas are liberally covered with horse manure, easily differentiated from cow pies. Clear evidence that horses, not cows, are responsible for this overgrazing.
The big difference between livestock operations on an allotment and a horse allotment, especially if they're overlapping one another, is that we have a robust management protocol set in place for livestock use. We know when they're going on, we know how many are going on, we know what pasture they're going to be in and what month, and we know when they're coming off. With horses, we just know they're there. We know they're going to be wherever they're comfortable, and they're going to be 365 days a year, they're going to be there. Generally speaking, on a year like this year, as hot as it is, those horses are shaded up. They're where you and I would be. They're in the shade trying to get water. They're trying to get green feed where they can find it. And generally speaking, that's riparian habitats. The impact to those riparian habitats has been devastating over the last 30 years.
Jenny Luciette is the Bureau of Land Management's Nevada Wild Horse and Burro Public Affairs Officer.
When you're looking at, on a national level, 90,000 horses in the area that was dedicated, again, per the law, as where they are to roam free based on the other multi-use, it can't support 90,000 horses, not for the long-term sustainability of that herd and everything else involved in it. What people don't understand, because it's not their guided interest, when we have ranchers out there, many a times those ranchers are obligated for their allotment, whether they're grazing cows or not, to maintain fences, to maintain water sources, to get that grass growing, to do all those additional things that never get talked about. And so we take away, say, all the cattle, or that right, which was put in place before the Wild Horse and Burro Act, the Great Taylor Grazing Act. And Congress decides they're going to wipe out that act. They're not only going to amend it, they're going to take it away. Then all of a sudden, you've lost a huge resource that we depend upon to get our ranges in great condition or good condition.
I mean, the people on the ground and the BLM and stuff, we're all on the same page. We're out here in the trenches. We see it every day. We know what's going on. We have really good BLM people. They would like to see these Nevada rangelands at AML to help everybody and be managed somewhat better. And one thing I want to bring up is there's a well to the south of us and a well to the north of us. Without us here, if we go away, there won't be any horses either. Nobody's going to be out here pumping the water for nothing and doing what we do. So that's a point that a lot of people in the horse world don't get. I mean, we have to be here for the horses' sustainability also. And we don't want to see all the horses gone, but I do want to see them managed.
Birth control is currently used by the BLM to reduce reproduction rates of the horses, but the significant logistical challenges of implementing and repeating it have so far prevented it from reducing the numbers.
I think they are a tool. However, they only function well when you're at AML. If you're trying to dart your way to AML, you'll never get there. You have to understand that most of those current drugs that are used require a booster. And so you capture the animal, which is traumatic in and of itself. So getting him into the pen to where you can actually grade what you have and actually administer PZP or PZP-22 is hard enough. But then the notion of having to come back in 60 days and actually administer a booster on a mare that's already been vaccinated is almost impossible in this kind of environment. They're all brown horses.
And when you do that simple math, which I think people tend not to do, if you've got 29,000 horses on the range compared to 90,000, half of those are at least mares. So now you've got double the babies being born each year. And so to be able to keep up with that foal crop is a very different situation than it was 14 years ago.
Permanent sterilization, such as gelding, is an option, but strongly opposed by many wild horse advocates.
You start talking about permanent sterilization and it's as bad as euthanasia was in some groups, and then you keep kind of, the whole argument rotates around to, well, if we took all the cows off, we could have plenty of room. If you come to the conclusion to where you want to pull other uses off the land, whether it be wildlife uses or whether it be livestock uses, and you get to the point to where you're going to manage exclusively for horses, that's a short-term fix. The dynamic that created that is still in play and it will be there.
Excess horse numbers and the effect on other wildlife in a rangeland with limited forage and water does not maintain an ecological balance as listed in the Wild Horse and Burrow Act.
If you've got an area that you've got 2,000 horses over what should be on that area and there's one water hole that's being shared by every other form of wildlife, what's going to take over? And if it's only producing 5 gallons of water an hour, how many horses can that suffice in a day's time when they need at least, 15 gallons, depending on the season, a day to survive? And whenever something gets over, whether it's cows or horses or deer or antelope or anything else, if there's not a balance to keep it at that number, it's going to affect not just themselves, but everything else around them.
There's a place for the horses, but they have to be managed and they have to be controlled, just like we do our livestock, just like we do with big game hunting. These are all management tools. The horses have seemed to have been exempt from that for a lot of years. We need to be able to circle back and come up with a management solution for these horses and try to educate the people that don't understand what's happening out here, the destruction of lands and other wildlife, and we're trading the horse for, other wildlife species that can't exist anymore.
I got on the Wild Horse and Burrow Advisory Commission as a wildlife biologist. I had an interest in protecting Nevada's wildlife because that was the years that I worked as a biologist. That was a major source of heartburn for me to watch that conflict going on unresolved. The message that we haven't gotten across to the public right now is that if we make it through this winter and we don't have a major die-off on horses, we likely will have one on a major die-off in some units on mule deer for sure.
Commissioner French in the early 70s was part of the panel that created the horse management areas still in use today.
We knew what those winter ranges were. We knew what the carrying capacity was for mule deer, for pronghorn, and any other sagebrush obligate species that are out there underground. And we established the use on those horses as a part of that ecosystem, assuming that they were going to be able to compete equally with one another on that piece of real estate. The minute you walk away and say, we're going to allow that horse population to go 3 or 4 times above what we agreed to, all the rest of those decisions all change at that point.
The main purpose of stopping at this winter fat place is winter fat is key to our operation. The sheep, we used to lamb 3 herds. We'd lamb a herd and a half from about 10 miles north to this point behind us. Then they would go up on Butte Mountain there. So then as horses started encroaching, there's about 1/3 of the allotment that we no longer could make use of, and now they're encroaching on the second third. So there's probably 1/3 left maybe. And the other thing is, a lot of people don't realize that a horse can do a lot more damage to a plant because they have 2 sets of teeth. And they can go right down here and nip that down to the ground. And a cow or a sheep, they don't have a set of teeth on top, so they have to pull, and they cannot get down to the roots like a horse can.
They'll eventually overgraze all the forage that's available to them until they die off and it starts to grow back. But once that happens, for some of these ecosystems will never grow back the same. Like the white sage on a lot of these big valleys in Nevada, they've tried to replant and reestablish, and they have a very low success rate at that. So once they ruin this white sage and it basically turns to halogeton, which is poison to any ruminant, once that happens, it'll probably never come back from that. It'll probably just stay halogeton. It'll basically take a farmer to come in and reseed something, and then it'll have to be on the right year with enough rain to get that seed started for something else to take over, but you'll never get this white sage back.
Obviously, Endangered Species Act requires special management of critical habitats and populations of wildlife, whether it be threatened or endangered. In many of those populations, under the Endangered Species Act, we completely removed all of the livestock off of them in order to manage the use of that riparian area to try to expand habitat. We didn't do anything with horses, and the horses are there 365. They get to utilize that riparian habitat, and they continue to degrade them. That is in direct conflict with the Endangered Species Act, because now, by mismanaging wild horses, we've allowed for their takings under the Endangered Species Act. That's been going on for years.
Often forgotten in the Wild Horse and Burrow Act is that if horse populations exceed appropriate management levels, control of horse numbers by destruction of excess animals is allowed. Public outcry has compelled Congress to ignore that wording in the Act, though some feel horse numbers are so out of control, a humane method to remove excess horses needs to be reconsidered.
The law is not being followed. It says very clearly in the law that the horses can be eliminated to keep the balance, but that's not happening.
We need to examine other options in order to get this thing fixed. It's been going on so long. It's 50 years since the Wild Horse and Burrow Act was passed, and nothing's ever been done. It just keeps getting worse, and the numbers keep growing.
Will it be brought back? Probably not, just because of the emotions of that. Maybe you don't want to eat horse meat, but it's protein. There's people all over the world that will use that as protein. There's people in Europe that raise horses for meat.
They could sell that product, use the money to come out and manage the rest of them. It'd be more humane for the horses than starving to death on some allotment that doesn't have any feed on it, or on a drought year like this and the spring goes dry and the horses are standing around it and they tromp their own foal into the mud trying to get a drink and trample it to death. I think putting them down humanely would be more humane than letting them suffer out there on the range.
You know, nobody wants to put down a healthy horse. I'm one of them. I think anybody that's been around them, you know, that it's not their fault that they're out there. But it's gotten down to the point now where there's not a lot of options left. By turning a blind eye to the federal estate the way they have done over the last 25 years has created the crisis we're in right now. We're at a point of critical mass to where I think we'll see some significant die-offs, either through shortage of water like we have in right now, or shortage of vegetation on a winter range.
There's nothing more miserable than watching an old horse stumbling around. And so they need to be taken care of. I mean, I love my horses. I got a field full of damn things. There's 8 sheep camps out right now, and there's a horse in every one of them.
Some contend that ranchers dislike horses. In fact, most have a love of horses, and they still play an integral role in the operation of the cattle ranch.
I'm a horse lover. I have a dozen of them in the corral. I make my living on horseback. I love horses, you know, and I've raised horses from babies and trained them myself. And the whole thing is I understand that I can't have all these horses out there on the range without suffering consequences, the negative impacts from them. I mean, if my horses were in that condition, somebody would be calling the cops on me, and somebody would be coming to take my horses from me if my horses were in the condition of these horses that are out on the range.
Hello, how you doing? Are you okay? This is Violetta. The boys found her. The mare was dead. Don't know what she died of, but she was dead. And this animal was about, a few hours away from being coyote feces herself. They brought her in, and we nursed her back to health, and she's doing rather well. She's kind of a pet around here. She thinks she's one of us. She's got a bale over there that she's working on pretty good. And she gets a bottle about 3 times a day. But her ribs were just all sticking out. She was pretty emaciated when we found her. They have a right to be out here. And there's some of them out here. Okay, I'm the kids say, I'm down with that. Okay, you got a deal. But nobody says, you know, if I started running twice as many animals as the allotment called for, you think the BLM put up with that? Nope, but her relatives are bulletproof.
The questions that Congress is dealing with right now has to do with recognizing, first off, there's a huge number of horses need to come off the federal estate. Secondly, what do we do with those horses? And how do we manage them long and short term? How do we adopt them? How do we process them?
So what's happening is you've got people that may only have a certain singular interest that are lobbying Congress, and that's who they're talking to. So that's the only side of the story they hear.
My thing about the wild horses is, number one, I hope it doesn't turn out to be the BLM's legacy that we're going to see how the West was lost. But it appears to me as though it will be that way. And there are 3 sons and their families living here on this ranch now. So as we go on through life, we've often told them from the beginning that our outcome was going to be determined by horses. And that's turning out to be truer than not.
Is it time once again for Americans to step in? Wild Horse Annie convinced us to convince Congress to save the horses in 1971. Perhaps it's time for us to tell Congress that saving the horses has created an environmental crisis on our western rangelands. Most agree the Wild Horse and Burrow Act is well written. Unfortunately, we failed to enact it as written. It states that we should keep the number of wild horses and burros on our rangeland limited to a number our western arid climate can sustain. Doing so would ensure that all wildlife and other species that depend on a healthy rangeland could survive, including those ranchers dedicated to growing your food on your public land. Funding for this program has been provided by the Nevada Rangeland Resources Commission.